Pentagon officials last week came the closest they have come so far to admitting that U.S. bombs killed Syrian civilians in the months-long war launched last year. An investigation into a November 2014 airstrike launched this January found evidence for the deaths of at least 4 children, among them a 5-year-old. Dozens of deaths have been attributed by news reports to U.S.-led airstrikes on Syria, a country that seems to have one overlapping war on another ever since the war broke out with the advent of the Arab Spring rebellions. The Islamic State militant organization, whose explosive rise prompted a U.S. air war, announced that it has taken over a key Syrian city of Palmyra, home to 65,000 residents and precious ancient artifacts. ISIS is estimated to be controlling about 50% of Syria now, even as President Bashar al-Assad's troops are waging a brutal war on rebel groups and the civilian population. And as in all wars, civilians are caught in the crossfire. My guest is Charles Glass. He has reported extensively from the Middle East and traveled frequently in Syria over several decades. His books include The Northern Front, a wartime diary about Iraq, and The Tribes Triumphant, a book about his time in Lebanon and when he was kidnapped by Hezbollah and held captive for 3 months. His latest book is called Syria Burning, ISIS and the Death of the Arab Spring. Welcome to Uprising, Charles.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. I want to begin with the history of the U.S. in Syria that most of us are not aware of, and that goes all the way back to 1949, when the U.S. CIA fomented a coup in Syria over what else but oil. Can you tell us that story and how that set into motion political instability in Syria in the years and decades following?
In 1948, there was a proposal to build a tap line, it's called a tap line, an oil pipeline from Saudi Arabia through Jordan and Syria to the coast in Lebanon. The Jordanians and the Saudis and the Lebanese agreed immediately, but the Syrian parliament wanted to discuss the terms and wanted to negotiate for better terms from the Arabian-American oil company. The United States didn't really like that, and the British didn't like it either. They approached the chief of staff of the Syrian army, Colonel Hosni Zaim, a Kurd as it happens. And Zaim agreed to stage a coup d'etat, thus overthrowing the parliamentary democracy that Syria had had. From then on, throughout the 50s and 60s, Syria had one military coup after another, some sponsored by the CIA, some sponsored by the Russians.
Right. You mentioned in your book that the U.S. made 2 more major attempts in the 1950s to decide Syria's future, with Operation Straggle and Operation Weapon. Both failed. What were these operations? Why did they fail? And was the ongoing U.S. interference in Syria through those decades centered on oil politics?
Well, as Wilbur Crane Eveland, who was one of the CIA operatives working out of Beirut at the time, wrote, he was taking suitcases full of money to some Syrian officers when they were caught. And if the Syrian intelligence services hadn't caught them on that occasion, those 2 coups would have been successful. There were many other coups that were successful, but the regimes were always short-lived until 1970, in the last military coup by Hafez al-Assad, who was the commander of the Air Force, an Alawite from northern Syria. And he established a regime that is, through his son, still in power today, although he's in power in a much smaller part of the country than his father controlled. In terms of oil politics, that was really 1949 was really the only crucial stage in Syria's history where oil was decisive in a change of government. Syria has barely enough oil on its own territory for domestic consumption. It's not a big player in the oil world like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates.